as much as you share, you never know what thing that you share will hit a nerve with someone and give someone that motivation to explore an avenue that might be helpful for them. So thank you so much, Ray. It's a pleasure to meet you. Take it away, Ray, if you could do a brief introduction.
My name is Ray Lubert. I'm originally from California, but I've lived in Colorado, Illinois, Ohio, and now the great state of New York. I work in healthcare finance, so I have a lot more hands-on approach than most people in terms of understanding the billing process and insurance and the potential pitfalls that in many cases result in people having missed treatment, or the opportunity to get treatment is something that they lose out on because they don't know that they can afford it, or they don't know what options are available, or their insurance simply won't pay for certain things unless the right hoops are jumped through. And so I'm able to navigate that probably better than most people just in managing their own health care, much less with a serious disease that alters their entire life. Received my diagnosis initially in 2019, and at that time, what led up to it was I was at a baseball game that was out in the heat a little bit. It was rainy. I was outside on a deck, and towards the end of it, I felt increasing bladder urgency. It was way beyond the amount of liquid that I'd had. And I felt kind of wobbly, so that I would get up and then I was a little bit unsure of my footing. And so I walked into the restroom, and that was really kind of an unpleasant feel to it. And after I was done, when it was time to go home, felt the walk to the car that was maybe a mile, maybe even a little bit more. Each progressive step, it felt like I was getting a little bit worse. I was getting hotter, and I was getting more stumbly. I needed to hold on to the wall just to kind of help myself along. My feet didn't want to pick up. And so especially my left foot, I noticed that as I tried to lift it just to walk foot in front of the other, it just didn't want to lift, and I was almost dragging it behind me. And so once I got into the car and I cooled down, everything was fine. It felt like maybe what had happened was that there was something wrong with my back. I didn't really understand it, and that I assumed, hey, maybe there's something that I should see the chiropractor about and see if maybe something's off with my hip that's just not letting my legs work quite right. And it wasn't every day after that. It was almost as if it fixed itself, but then it just didn't. A few days later, our air conditioning went out, and in the heat, it was really unpleasant. We bought a portable air conditioner just to hold us over for a couple of days until the repairman would come out. And I picked up the portable air conditioner, and I'm fairly strong, or at least I have been. I picked this thing up, and it was pretty heavy. It was easily 80 or 100 pounds. And I felt like my back was again just kind of going out, that it would give up. And I got it into the cart, and I got it into the car. But after that, I felt like my legs just weren't working quite right, and I was a little bit wobbly again. But then it just went away. And probably the next day, or shortly thereafter, we went to the movies, and I saw an evening movie. And during the movie, which was also a little bit odd because it was one with the speakers in the seat that would rumble a little bit.
Oh,
And
okay.
so there was sensory input that I wasn't used to, but my legs started to feel weird, and my feet started to feel weird. And so I'd start to get this little tingling in the bottom of my feet. And then by the time the movie was over, my feet were starting to actually go numb.
Wow.
And so on the way home, I decided this is something that doesn't just get fixed with the chiropractor visits and it's an ongoing thing. This is something that actually needs an ER visit. And so, of course, with insurance, there are hoops to jump through for an ER visit to get covered properly. And so I went through those hoops and I made the phone call to the advice nurse with my insurance system who said, yes, you need to go to the ER. And for me, in the plan that I was on at that time, that was the difference between a $250 copay and a $100 copay, just making that phone call.
Wow, that's a big
So I went
difference.
to the ER and I had a doctor that was very reasonable and understood and listened and could recognize that there was a very clear something wrong, but it was a very much unknown something wrong. And it didn't have a good answer for why. And so I had a CT done and I had a batch of MRIs done. I think at that time they just did the brain and cervical to make sure that there was nothing absolutely life-threatening that was happening. But they didn't have any good answers. And he said, at that point, we don't know what the answer is.
Wow.
We're going to get a neurologist involved. There's somebody on staff that will be here tomorrow. This was a Saturday night. So Sunday, they were expecting a neurologist in that would look at the situation and maybe have some better ideas of how to proceed with the diagnostics. And we recommend, he told me, that you actually stay the night at the hospital and then we'll continue with the diagnostics and go from there. You can go home, I can release you, but we recommend that if you're actually admitted, you might get better answers sooner. So I did go ahead and get admitted. They continued with a whole battery of blood tests and more MRIs. I ended up with and without contrast for the brain and cervical spine, and the thoracic spine with and without contrast, and the lumbar spine with and without contrast. And in retrospect, looking back on it, they had plenty enough to make a absolute diagnosis at that point, just from reading through the notes and reading the actual images of the MRIs. But they also went ahead and did the lumbar puncture to get the spinal tap for a definitive diagnosis from lab tests. So this entire process actually took a couple of days.
Okay.
And so I believe it was Monday, or it might have even been Tuesday, that I got the absolute certain, yes, you have MS diagnosis. And it was a team of people that actually came in for when I got that. It was a main neurologist, but it was also a whole bunch of residents who were there. So they had the neurology on their rotations at that point. And so none of them were actually talking to me. They were just observing. And I, at that point, got just the answer part, but not the treatment expectations part. And it was, I believe, that Tuesday, later on in the day, that I got started with the IV steroids, pretty hefty dose of steroids. And they also gave me I think it was like an omeprazole or something similar, PPI, to help with possible digestive issues that happen with some people who have massive doses of steroids. I didn't have any problems. And subsequent to that, I've had steroids on other times and haven't had any problems. So I assume that it's likely that I wouldn't, but again, it's just a precaution. In my situation, I really didn't notice any significant improvement that day or the next day when I also had an IV treatment, or even the day after that with that infusion treatment. It was probably the 5th day consecutive for infusions that I really started noticing an improvement to the major symptoms that I had. And by that time, before it actually got better, I had essentially no feeling in my feet and
Oh, wow.
very little feeling at all in my legs all the way up to my thighs, some
Wow.
feeling in my thighs, and some numbness and tingling about halfway up my chest.
Oh, wow.
I also had some paresthesia, is the term, in my left hand and going up my arm a bit. So it was creeping back towards the vitals, and it was progressively more terrifying.
Yeah.
And I was very glad to have been in the hospital for, if nothing else, a little bit of a sense of relief and comfort in knowing that I'm getting closer to some answer just by being where they can do all the tests.
Wow.
So after the third day of IV infusions, I was released. I went home. They gave me a walker. At that point, I lived in a 2-story home. The bedroom was on the second floor. I was able to walk just fine up and down the stairs. I had to look more carefully than I was used to, just to make sure that my feet were actually where I thought they were, because they would respond, but I didn't get the tactile feedback from exactly when the foot was on the stair or not. So at that point, when I was being released, they also had a physical therapy consult with someone to make sure that I was able to go up and down the stairs properly in the controlled setting of the hospital. And they assisted my wife with some instructions for how to handle helping me. And I got a big, heavy belt that she could use to help kind of hold on to my waist and guide me, to make sure that if I was a little bit wobbly but not actually falling down all the way, she could help correct that. Obviously, with a person falling down, you, as just another person without help, may not be able to catch them all the way, but you may be able to help guide them a bit. We were able to get some tools to go home with for a little bit more reassurance. The outpatient infusions were slow, but the whole process is slow even in the best of cases. The process with the outpatient visits, again, that was over the weekend, so it was a little bit odd going into a place that's open 7 days in the middle of offices that are not. And so most of the people that were there with me getting infusions were there for something entirely different. Many of them with end-stage renal disease or severe cancer,
Sure.
or some other situation where they required either a infusion of whole blood or an infusion of some really icky medicine, or as something that put them in a very much at-risk health state that I wasn't also in.
Sure.
So it was a little bit odd to see somebody who was mostly healthy in the basically cancer ward. And so that felt a little bit out of place for me, but it got done, and I was able to, after that, start working from home for a few days as I sort of transitioned back into daily life. But I didn't really have all the answers at that point either. I mean, I had the diagnosis, I had the treatment done. I had no idea how much of my lost sensation I would get back.
Okay.
And I had no idea whether I was going to need to continue to use a walker for a long period of time or not, whether I would be able to continue to live on a second floor situation. All of those were at that point still unknown. It was,
And mentally processing from an emotional
oh
perspective.
yeah,
How was that? How was that?
that was still overwhelming at that point. The hospital room that I was in was the best I'd ever seen. And I've toured a lot of hospitals in my line of work and seen a lot of really nice places to be sick at. But where I was at was really nice. The food was really good. Anything that I wanted to order, the menu was wide open. It wasn't some icky hospital food situation where I could only get Jello and bouillon and stuff like that. It was the full menu, and I was able to order whatever I wanted, as much as I wanted, and they would bring it up. And so I ended up ordering for my wife as well because she was there for the whole time.
Right.
And they didn't charge anything extra for it. And I was able to look out the window and see the front area of the hospital where everybody would walk in on their way to start their shift in nursing or whatever it was they were doing in healthcare, and then walk out. And there were geese out there. The geese actually kind of terrorized the people walking in and out of the building. And that was a bit amusing in a Schadenfreude kind of way. But it was nice to be able to see some sense of regular everyday life, even though I was in the hospital. But coming home, I was able to adjust pretty well. And work understood very easily that I was going to have some limitations that I didn't even know what they would be for quite some time, and I couldn't know. So I was able to work from home for that week and then go back into the office the following week, and that all worked out pretty well.
As you work in healthcare, I imagine a lot of understanding about a diagnosis of MS and a lot of empathy and support from the workplace. Is that fair to say? Or?
That's fair to say, although I don't think anybody that I had direct contact with in my work really knew very much about the disease, because most people wouldn't, even in healthcare, financial, because the diseases that we deal with on a regular basis are all just on paper and not necessarily something that a person would have personal exposure to the patient, not in what I do anyway.
Sure.
So there was a lot of answering questions about what it actually means to have MS. And so I got used to that little set of stories and explaining it as MS is essentially an attack on an electrical cord. If that electrical cord is your nerve, the sheath around it, the insulation there is the myelin. And what happens if you have that electrical cord where you get a little cut or you melt off some of that sheath around it, you have a short. And that's what happens with MS. And that's something that people generally seem to understand pretty well. An electrical cord is exactly the right analogy to kind of make that understandable to average people that don't do a lot of reading of medical texts or understanding specialty diseases and management of those. So I got pretty practiced in making that speech.
Yeah, and that's probably the clearest explanation that I've heard as well. So thank you for sharing. I'm sure folks will gravitate towards that explanation because there will be individuals who get the diagnosis who struggle with exactly that communication. How do I tell folks who may not understand medical terminology? And I think that's fantastic that you found a good way.
So it was probably a month and a half before I actually got my neurologist follow-up to start with disease modifying therapy. And so during that time, of course, I had a lot of questions. Well, what now? How do I continue? What's the next step? And I don't think I got as many answers from that initial consult as I really wanted. But I've been able to read a lot online to sort of fill in those blanks. And now looking back on that, I would have really have benefited much earlier from reading through the MS subreddit and getting the benefit of the wisdom of people that have been with it for years or decades to pass on little tips and tricks and things that I might relate to and that sort of thing. I did get the benefit of my network of friends that came together to say, well, here's this person that I know of that you're not connected with now, but you probably should be, because they can help with some of the tips and tricks aspect of it. And so I was able to connect with people on the West Coast and make some meaningful progress in terms of trying to help the situation become better. Important things of sleep is absolutely critical to healing and to maintaining a good outcome possibility. Without sleep, your body will get worse faster. Additionally, diet and exercise are very important. And so I was able to get those tidbits from people.
And what sort of diet changes were recommended?
Well, one of the things that I actually started doing on a regular basis was I have a green juice. I got a juicer actually a few months before my diagnosis as a perk from a health program with my work. I got an Amazon gift card, and so we chose that to use to get a juicer. It sounded like a neat thing to do, and it turned out to be very useful for what I wanted to do going forward. And so I have this green juice that smells like a lawnmower, and it is primarily cucumbers, but also kale and spinach and a little bit of apple, a little bit of kiwi. And I've been having that at least 4 days a week, but almost every day for, at this point, more than 2 years. I don't know that it's any one specific thing about that, but I do know that in past times, I've had a slightly low iron count, and that has helped with that. And I'm sure that some of the inclusion of the fresh kale and fresh spinach means some other vitamins that I'm getting on a regular basis that maybe I'm not absorbing very well otherwise. It might be better. I can't really say for sure. I don't know that that's the magic bullet, but it's something that I believe in.
Great.
Additionally, I have been pushing hydration quite a bit. I usually have between 3 and 5 liters of fluid a day. So much more than the average 8 glasses of water that some people think is still out of reach. I'll have easily 2 liters before breakfast on a lot of days.
Oh, wow. That is quite.
Just because overnight you really lose a lot of fluid, and getting that back in first thing in the day means that the rest of your day you may be much more alert and thinking more clearly just from the hydration. And some people attribute that to their morning coffee. And it may be that what they're really getting out of that is some extra fluid that they're losing otherwise. And the fact that it's caffeinated may actually not be helping them at all.
Sure.
But I don't know. That's pure conjecture.
And that's simple things that folks take for granted that could be incredibly important. Sleep, nutrition, hydration. Those are fantastic pieces of advice, regardless of whether or not you're healthy or you have a condition. I think that's absolutely, and importantly, all of those suggestions are within reach, things that people can work on.
I also start the day with a high protein meal. It's egg whites and cheese. I use a Starfleet pan. It's from Canada, and it's a special kind of nonstick. So I just put the cheese in there in the pan. No oil, no nothing. The cheese just in the pan, shredded cheese, and let that start to melt a little bit. Then egg whites, and as that starts to cook, I fold it over to do an omelet out of it. But it's a cheese on the outside omelet. So it's at the same time crisp and kind of toasty tasting, almost like a Cheez-It. And then it's fluffy and moist, and the eggs turn out great that way. And I really miss that when I go out on the road on vacation or travel with work or something, because it's so simple and yet so out of reach for most people.
That's great.
But that also meant that when I was on an oral pill twice daily, Tecfidera, which has a risk of some digestive upset and some flushing. I would avoid the flushing entirely and avoid the worst of the digestive upset by having it after that eggs and cheese meal, which is heavier, and it means that it forces the digestion to slow down a little bit.
Wow, that's a great insight. So was Tecfidera the first treatment that you were given after the steroids?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
And the fatigue from that was pretty significant at first. I ended up a few days off work because of that, both at the initial starter dose and again when I ramped up in a few weeks to the full dose, which was twice the starter dose. And I imagine that's probably similar to how the reaction is on average for Vumerity, because they're almost the same medication.
Yep.
Tecfidera is now available in the generic, which meant a problem for me because I was on the manufacturer's copay assistance with that. If I went with the generic, I'd have no copay assistance. But once I navigated that by having the doctor prescribe it as dispense as written, my insurance company got wise and said, hey, we're going to tack on this penalty amount for getting the brand name when the generic is available. So they charged extra. It didn't end up costing me any extra because it went to the copay assistance program. But there were a few months like that, and it showed up as a roughly $2,600 a month penalty amount for getting the brand name.
Wow.
The manufacturer got wise to how much money that was costing them, and they said, hey, instead of having this copay assistance unlimited, we're now changing the rules on you, and starting in like 3 weeks, it's going to be capped at $20,000 per year, which on the surface would be perfectly fine for most people that have insurance. Even if they're on an 80-20 plan, the cost of the medication after insurance does their contractual adjustment is going to be low enough that even 20% of that, 12 fills a year, probably not over $2,000 or $20,000.
Sure.
But my situation on a high deductible plan at that point, where my deductible and out-of-pocket max were $6,750 a year, I would hit that, and then every month there was still the $2,600 penalty, and I just kind of did the math and said, well, something's got to change because I'm going to run out of copay assistance if I stay on the brand name.
Sure.
I'm going to have no copay assistance at all if I go to the generic. And so either way, I have to do something different, or I'm going to have to pay $6,750 a year or more in out-of-pocket costs just for my maintenance medication.
Sure.
And so I ended up switching just about a month ago to Ocrevus, a twice yearly infusion, and that I expect is going to kind of solve that problem as well. I already hit my deductible and out-of-pocket maximum for this year. So my first set of infusions on that were totally covered to begin with. The pre-insurance cost for that, the charges amount, would be $86,000 every 6 months. With insurance, the contracted amount would be $34,000. And that's one of the big disparities in our healthcare system, that we continue to perpetuate this difference between what one person pays and what the next person pays for the same service. And the charges are not transparent, because if you start with $86,000 and then do a little shell game and you're okay with actually receiving $34,000, why is that not the price up front? And so that is something that I think is going to take a long time for our healthcare system to address in this country, but it just further hammers home how broken our system is, that the cost after my insurance of $34,000 is not the same as the cost would be after the next person's insurance. It might be 38,000 or it might be 30,000, and 10 different people will have 10 different after insurance amounts, and then their patient portion, it'll be 10 different amounts for that too. And that's just not how healthcare should be. Regardless of whether you think single payer is a good idea or whether you think some modification of that is a good idea, everything about our healthcare system right now is broken. And this is just one more explanation of how that is right now and how it needs to be changed.
Oh, absolutely. And you have the savvy to navigate. You realize your out of pocket with Tecfidera was on an unsustainable path. In either direction, either you stayed with the branded or you went to the generic. Either way, you were in a bad situation. You were savvy enough to recognize that by switching to Ocrevus, with the medical benefit on the infusion side, you had that benefit there. Not very many people understand it well enough to know that.
And I was able to get the appointment with my neurologist scheduled far enough out that I could wait for the 4 months between when I found out and when I would start on the new thing. And not everybody's able to do that. And I've read online stories on Reddit where people find out when it has already happened and they get the bill. Yeah. And at that point, not only can they not fix it that month, but it's going to be that 3 or 4 months before a good solution can happen. And for many people, that means going without the DMT for those 3 or 4 months because they simply can't afford it. And that's a situation that is, again, a very broken part of our healthcare system and needs to be addressed.
I agree completely.
So I also recently read an article where they estimated that approximately 30% of all medications prescribed and orders given for medical tests and treatments are unnecessary in this country. And in anything, if you have 30% waste in the industry, you're not making money if it's a for-profit business. And in this case, that means that the people who are paying for the insurance are paying that 30% extra for the same thing that they actually need, because there are all of these unnecessary things that are being paid for just out of hand because nobody's questioning it.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And part of the challenge, right, is the waste is someone's income, in the chain somewhere. And so that becomes
very little incentive to reduce that waste. A doctor who gets paid based on a fee-for-service schedule, the more things they do, the more they get paid. Yeah. And the lab that gets paid per lab test that they process gets money the same way. The more things they do, the more money they make. And to tell them, yes, but you should do less, but not also fix the system that reinforces them wanting to do more, is broken. And it's just not going to happen. It simply will not solve itself unless there is some meaningful intervention that's done. And they've tried to do that with value-based purchasing and quality outcomes. That does a little. They've tried to address some of those issues with price transparency, and yet an estimate recently said that 75% of hospitals in this country simply are not compliant with price transparency in its first steps. And it's
Wow.
not very transparent right now, even the ones that are compliant with it. But the very first steps for price transparency are not being followed
Wow.
because, on the whole, those healthcare providers, the hospitals, find it cheaper to pay the fines
Oh,
than it
wow.
is to convert their system over to comply with the rules for price transparency, because the fines are roughly $110,000 a year. But it may cost more than that to update their software and their processes to make it possible to have the rules followed for price transparency. And it's
Wow.
going to continue to be like that unless we change the fines dramatically, and that doesn't really fix the problem. And on the other side, we could change how the transparency is implemented and make more systems available to support these hospitals, many of which aren't really making any money anyway. A large portion of the hospitals in this country are either not for profit or they're community owned,
Sure.
and they're not in it to profit. They're just trying to keep up with their light bill on their payroll.
Yeah. Well, and
So
you have a lot of uncompensated care as well. So there's this sort of strange, yeah, it's just
absolutely.
such a complicated situation. So your experiences with Tecfidera and Ocrevus, how would you describe those for folks who haven't been on these therapies? Have they improved your quality of life or maintained it at least? And how would you describe your experience with those?
Overall, with Tecfidera, I had only occasional flushing, very mild at that. On occasions, I would take some aspirin to help with that, but I really didn't need to treat it in general. On the occasions I had flushing, it was when I failed to have the medicine at the normal time with my eggs to help kind of coat the stomach. And so maybe I just had a light breakfast or I had it a little bit late. And so it had an unprotected stomach to it attached to. For the flushing, not really much of an issue for me. The digestive upset was basically every day
Oh, okay.
for the time that I was on it. The fatigue would come and go. So some days were better than others in terms of fatigue. I'm not certain how much of that was just the drug and how much of that was MS in general and how much of that was maybe something unrelated entirely. So it's hard to know there. But since I've been off of it, I've noticed much less fatigue overall, as well as having maybe more feeling of being able to do things physically. And I'm differentiating that from fatigue because it's one thing to just be tired and not want to go up the stairs, but a completely other thing where going up the stairs feels physically difficult, not from being tired, just because of the exertion of it.
Sure.
And so both of those were addressed by stopping the Tecfidera.
Wow.
And I've been doing exercise in a home gym situation, lifting weights. We got a dumbbell set this year so that we can do social distancing, but still have the regular exercise. And I've been able to level up with the weights pretty consistently. But after I got off the Tecfidera, I feel like that is speeding up and I'm getting better results faster.
Great.
So that may just be a momentum thing. It may be in my head. It may actually be the situation of the drug was kind of getting in the way. I don't know for sure, but I like the results no matter what the situation was on that.
Absolutely. And how often are you able to exercise? How much time a day these days? How does it work?
I'm doing that every day, at least some. First thing in the morning just to get the blood flow, but also periodically throughout the day because I'm working at home and I'm in my basement. If I get a little bit of the afternoon doldrums, the kind of tired and faded feeling, lacking some attention span, not having the mental clarity, any of those things, I'll get up, lift weights for 5 minutes, get that blood moving again, and get that mental clarity back. And it comes very, very quickly. I'm really surprised at how effective that is just to get up and get moving a little bit to help the day go better.
That is fantastic because, brain fog is something that is real. How would you describe that for you, maybe before the treatment, and did that improve at all with the treatment?
I don't know that brain fog has really been an issue that I've noticed with MS specifically.
Okay.
I have definitely noticed that with lack of sleep.
Sure.
And so I don't know if it would be something that would be a problem for me if not for the MS. It's impossible to separate the two,
Sure.
but I do know that the sleep and the sleep quality make a huge difference in not having brain fog and being able to have continued attention span throughout the day.
So how is your mobility these days? I know when you first were diagnosed, that was sort of the challenge you had, that you were given the walker, etc. How is that for you?
For the most part, I don't on a daily basis use a cane, a walker, or any assistance like that. I do have regular physical therapy I've gone to for a couple of months, and I now know some of the exercises that will continue my process to improve my range of motion and abilities in my lower limbs in moving. Just going forward, I think that it's going to get better. It's going to continue to get better. And if nothing else, I can stop degeneration. And I know some of that is from atrophy, from allowing it to get worse and not really push my boundaries. And so in that realm, one thing that I would say is be sure to ask about physical therapy, because it may be something that the neurologist or the primary care physician doesn't proactively recommend, but it could still be something that they order and insurance will pay for it and it'll help.
That is wonderful advice, right? Because if the doctor doesn't offer it, if you don't know whether to ask, you might not, you definitely won't get it. That's fantastic.
For Ocrevus, my first infusion, the thing that I noticed most about that was actually the steroid buzz that night, because they gave me the pregame cocktail of some Benadryl and some cortisone, and it was IV cortisone, so it hits a little bit differently from the pills, but I didn't really feel much at that time, and I didn't have any adverse reaction to the infusion at all. And I don't think that there was anything that I felt from that infusion or the second dosage that I could say, yes, I feel differently because of the Ocrevus. But I do know that the steroid treatment meant that I had interrupted sleep that night. And so I really felt poorly the next day from that lack of sleep. And I can say definitively that it was that lack of quality sleep that night that was why I felt badly the next day. The second treatment, I addressed that by having the doxylamine succinate, the NyQuil pill, basically, and was able to kind of overcome the momentum of the steroid by medicating the other way, had quality sleep, felt fine the next day.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. So you figured it out, one experience and to the next, you were able to address it proactively. That is fantastic.
So since then, I had one day that I had some overwhelming fatigue sort of out of nowhere. It wasn't right after my second infusion. It was maybe a week later. I don't know if it was at all related. It may just be one fluke MS day that I feel tired for no obvious reason. People have those. I hear about them on a regular basis or read about them. And so it could just be that. It could be something else entirely. I don't know. But My employer is very flexible in terms of being able to work with me when I need to take a nap in the middle of the day because suddenly I'm tired. I'll just work a little bit later in the evening. As long as the work gets done, it's fine. So in that sense, I'm very, very fortunate to have a line of work where that flexibility is possible. And not everybody has that kind of line of work that if something comes up, the employer can make accommodations. And so I guess looking back, I'm very glad to have made the choices that led to a line of work where I have options if something goes wrong. And so that was something that I commented on even right after my diagnosis, is saying, hey, even though I just got this life-changing, very bad news, I also at the same time feel very fortunate because for most people, they wouldn't have perfect storm of an employer that's understanding, an insurance that covers well, and the understanding of how to navigate the processes, and the ability to take time off, and supporting household, all of those things that made it possible to have a very, very different experience from somebody who's maybe 22, an average age to get an MS diagnosis, and they're on their own, and they have a roommate that's kind of a jerk sometimes, and they have a job where they're on their feet all day, and maybe they're out in the sun, something like that, where there's so many things working against them. They've got junk insurance or no insurance. All of those things are not the situation that I had. And most people, even if they don't have the situation I had, don't have a situation that's free from any one of those things that is a detractor. And I felt very fortunate to not have any detractors.
That is wonderful. And you know, on Reddit, right, you hear many stories of exactly
Absolutely.
what you've described. And so that your ability to go to Reddit and to help others and share your perspective, particularly on the reimbursement side of things, that is an absolutely phenomenal gift that you can give to folks, especially younger folks who, you know, this stuff is complicated. It takes a while to develop the expertise that you have, and that's a wonderful thing. So you mentioned a supportive family. How is your family managing through? And
My wife is very understanding, not only that my needs are different, but also that I may not be able to fully communicate those needs at times. That if I have a situation of intense fatigue that comes out of nowhere, I get over hot or something like that, and I'm just done for the day, I may not be able to clearly and concisely say that. And she's able to pick up clues and those visual cues to see that maybe I'm a little stumbly and I might need the cane, or I might need to go sit down for a little bit, or go be in the air conditioning, or something, that it may be better just to get everything assembled for me as we go out the door in the morning, because I'm used to how long things take before MS and what my normal process is in getting ready to go out the door. It's very different now. The amount of time it takes me to go up and down the stairs, or to go through my mental checklist of, do I have my wallet? Do I have my keys? Do I have my watch? Do I have my sunglasses? Do I have the receipts for the things that I want to return? Do I have my shopping list prepared? Are there any coupons that I need to have with us, or anything like that? When we're going out for the day, I have a checklist of stuff, and sometimes I know that I get interrupted in the process, and that kind of mental fog may still be there from getting up in the morning, and it's different from what it was before. And I have to start the process all over again to just make sure that I didn't miss something. So her being cognizant of some of my limitations and some of what I'm not able to adequately communicate is very, very helpful. So it's very good to have somebody on my team for getting this done. It also means that I'm able to do more and better as a result.
Absolutely. And in terms of hobbies and things you do outside of work, how have those been impacted by MS?
Well, one of the things that I've always had as a hobby was cooking. And so my knife skills are noticeably impacted by my dexterity at this point. I have some limited paresthesia in both hands, some of the pins and needles feeling. And so I don't have the same sensory feedback if I, without looking, reach into my pocket to grab something out. I may not feel exactly that set of keys or that credit card. I may not feel a card at all. I may just kind of grab and hope that it's in my hand and it not know for sure until I get it out and look. So that's a little bit odd. So with knife skills, that means that I cut more slowly now in order to not cut off a finger or something. But I still do probably just as much cooking. I just do it a little bit differently.
Understood. Any good recipes that you would recommend?
Another egg thing that I often do as an alternate is I'll take little mason jars and in the blender, I'll fill that up with the egg whites, cottage cheese, and some other kind of cheese, and then some pepper in there. Blend it up so that the egg whites fully incorporate with the cottage cheese and everything, and then pour it into the mason jars. Mostly tighten the lids, but not all the way.
Yeah.
Put them in a water bath with what's called an immersion circulator for the sous vide cooking method, and cook them at 165 degrees for an hour in order to get them soft set and perfectly safe to eat. And then because they're in the mason jars, they're self-sealing, and as they come out, they cool off and the jar lid sucks tight. Everything in there is perfectly pasteurized, and it's good for weeks in the refrigerator, easily 6 or 8 weeks.
That is a life hack right there. That is fantastic.
Additionally, I use that immersion circulator for a lot of other things. When we buy bread, I don't eat a lot of bread. I may have a slice or two, maybe have a sandwich, and then the rest of the loaf of bread goes bad because it's sitting on the counter and it gets moldy. And even really good bread, if we try to save it by putting it in the fridge, it gets a little bit wet or it gets weird and hard, and it's just not very pleasant after once or twice that we use it, and there's so much waste involved in that. So we'll get a really nice loaf of sourdough, slice it up, and then portion it out into like a 2-slice portion or a 4-slice portion or something, and put it in vacuum seal bags and suck out most of the air, but not enough to actually squish the bread. Just before that, we'll stop it, and then put it back in the immersion circulator to heat treat that to get rid of all of the microbes so that there's no mold growing in there, and then it's safe on the counter for months. You can easily get 6 months out of bread that is treated like that with temperature in the vacuum bag. So I've actually gotten the idea on that from products I've seen at Costco, where they have pre-sealed bread, like a sourdough bread bowl or a loaf of French bread that's in that vacuum seal, and then it says used by, and that date is 6 months out. It is fantastic, and we've tested that, just left it on the shelf for quite a while, and it's just as good as the first day. So I started doing that with everything, whether it's bagels, like we'll get a dozen fresh bagels, but then seal most of them. We'll have 2 of them that day, and then the rest of them we'll keep for later. But They don't have to be frozen. They don't have to be refrigerated. They just have to be heat treated and sealed.
And that's such the perfect combination with Costco too, because you always get too much of whatever it is, and you get sick of
Right.
it by the end of the week. So that's the best way, actually. It's wonderful.
Additionally, we get a lot of things from Costco that are large packages of smaller portion size amounts that are sealed. So we'll get a big, huge package of chicken burgers, but they're sealed to have 2 of them, or there are 4 of them in the package. So it's not so much as to be tired of it. It's just we'll take out a meal worth and have the others in the freezer.
Yeah, that's a great way to do it. Great way to do it. So Ray, I've enjoyed this conversation. The richness of your experience. First of all, you've been through the journey. You're managing through it. Your ability to think about the financial side of the equation, which is as critical and important to maintaining health, but also sort of the treatments, the physical therapy, all of that makes your journey really, really powerful and will be absolutely helpful for others living with MS and working through. Any sort of final advice you would like to give to folks with MS to power their journeys?
Well, there's another part of it that looking back, I've been able to identify things that almost certainly were MS 10 years before I got the diagnosis, and even 15 years before the diagnosis, that were probably it being active, but at a lesser degree, where it was not really diagnosable and not the same from one day to the next. I might randomly have a digestive issue that means that I have something that seems to not agree with me that day, but that same thing causes no problems at all the following week, which tells me overall, because this happened many, many times,
Sure.
that it wasn't that one thing, it wasn't that other thing, it was that something goofy was going on with my digestion that was not related to the specific thing that I was eating. Additionally, I had some negative outcomes from being exposed to prolonged heat, and I would get intensely fatigued after baseball games, just being in the heat. And I didn't put that together with the MS until years later after the diagnosis. But looking back, I can say this is exactly why, after being out in the heat for that baseball game, I really felt poorly for the rest of that day. Just looking back, I was able to identify that and found out after the fact that 100, 150 years ago, when MS was first even kind of being discovered, that there was a thing, the preliminary diagnosis at that point was based on putting somebody in a hot bath for an extended period of time to see if they had a physical degradation of their motor skills, or they had other issues that are sort of like a false flare-up because of the heat. And so that was an initial diagnostic step. For me, I could have potentially started on the pathway to diagnosis if I had realized that heat sensitivity was a thing that could be indicative of something. So, kind of looking back with that, there are times that I had something that could have been diagnostically relevant, like I said, 10 or 15 years prior to actually being diagnosed. And the MRI records show a vast number of old lesions that support that say, hey, there was a thing at some point in the past, and it happened many, many times. It probably happened over a number of years. So chances are these old lesions are from things, from events that happen that could have been identified as an MS flare-up a long time before if all of the pieces were put together properly, but they just didn't happen that way. I had an event where I had some paresthesia in my left hand. They did the EMG test for the nerves in my arm, and everything seemed absolutely normal. Probably because the issue with my hand was actually in my
Yeah.
spinal cord.
Yes.
And they didn't know to look there for the issue. And so it didn't show up when they tested the nerves from my shoulder to my hand. Everything tested fine. And I didn't have other symptoms that they could absolutely definitively say, hey, this is the differential for MS as opposed to something else.
Sure.
So it just didn't happen.
Sure. Yeah. If you're at the wrong specialist, right? Maybe you needed to be an neurologist, right?
Right. Additionally, with Tecfidera, I don't think it helped me as an ongoing therapy as much as it should have. If there's a continuum between very safe treatments on the one side and then very effective treatments on the other side, it's almost all the way to the safe side. It tends to have very little impact to most people, but it probably does a little bit less than most of the other disease management therapies out there. The experience I had about a year ago, moving from Ohio to New York, very, very stressful time with COVID exploding at that time. I ended up with a relapse from that.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm certain that it is just a question of stress at that time that brought it on.
Sure.
And so that brings up another key point of like life advice, perhaps, that stress management is right up there with proper sleep in terms of being possibly the most important two things to keep in mind for ongoing health in all ways, but specifically for somebody who is living with MS.
Sure. And stress of a move, I guess that's certainly not always avoidable. What are some everyday things that you do to manage stress?
Take a breath, completely stop everything, have a quiet 5 minutes in the middle of the day, close my eyes and just be for a moment. 5 minutes isn't going to really interrupt the workday, but that 5 minutes of clarity could make the rest of the workday much more effective.
That's wonderful advice. That's wonderful advice. And we all have that, right? I mean, I think the beauty of a lot of your advice, sleep, diet, take moments of clarity, things that everyone can do. Fantastic. Well, Ray, this has been a wonderful conversation. You've shared so much, and again, very, very inspired by your journey that you continue to plow through, and it looks like you're doing extremely well. Thank you, and look forward to definitely staying in touch. Whenever someone has a question, either they're curious about your journey, or they're just been diagnosed with MS and they don't know what to expect. Feel free to share the video, and hopefully well, I can absolutely say that you will be able to help someone down the line. So, Ray, thank you so much. It was a pleasure meeting you, and thank you so much for your generosity with your time as well. Really do appreciate it. Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too as well. Enjoy the rest of the day here. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.